Hearing me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I am so glad to be here. And people, I've spent the past 6 months in New Zealand, and sometimes I'll tell people I'm from Oakland University, and they go, Auckland. And I say, no, it's not Auckland, New Zealand. It's Oakland. And then they go, oh, there's a town in California named Oakland. You're from California with palm trees and it's nice and warm. And actually, no, I'm from Michigan. And Oakland University is in Oakland Township, Michigan. And it's cold there during the winter. So that's me going to work on a typical February day. The course I teach, as was mentioned, is called Learning How to Learn. And my co-instructor is Terry Sanowski, who's the Francis Crick Professor at the Salk Institute. And incidentally, I should say, this is Terry when he's going to work, well, taking a little break at the Salk Institute. He truly is in California. And that's one of the great things about online teaching is that not only can students get together from very different places, but even professors can have very different backgrounds. Now, to my surprise, I was invited to speak at Harvard. I was really quite nervous because, it's Harvard. And I walked into the room and I became even more nervous because it was packed, standing room only. And I thought, why are there so many people here? Turns out our one little course made for virtually nothing, mostly in my basement. That's a pan shot of my basement to make it look bigger. Had on the order of the same number of students as all of Harvard's massive open online courses and online courses put together, made for millions of dollars with hundreds of people. And what this tells you is that people all around the world are starved for fresh insights into how to learn effectively that's based on solid neuroscience and good research rather than decades old theory that was devised before we had any idea of how the brain worked. Now, what I want to share with you today is a little bit about how the brain works, but we need to start with today's revolutionary story, which involves, of course, generative AI. So I'm going to give you a 2-minute history of generative AI. In 2017, a paper was published called Attention is All You Need, and that was published in the Neural Information Processing Systems Conference. And my co-instructor, Terry Sanowski, is the president of this conference. This conference is so important in AI that it typically has around 10,000 registration spots in it. And when they open registration, all 10,000 spots are filled within less than 10 minutes. So Terry told me this paper was submitted, and at the time they thought, nothing special. The reviewers just relegated it off to a corner to be given in a poster session by some grad students. But as it turns out, this paper is so important, it has now been cited over 150,000 times. And that is because it developed the idea of the transformer. Now, the transformer, we're not going to go into the details, but I just want to, some of you know what's going on already. You have an encoder where you feed in a prompt with the question you're asking. And then you have a decoder that spits out the result, the answer to your question or to your prompt. But for our purposes here today, we're not so much interested in the internal goings on of a transformer. What we're really interested in is that the flow of information through a transformer is remarkably similar to the flow of information through the human brain. And this should be no surprise, because through the summers and the winters of AI development, whenever the artificial intelligence experts would get stuck on something, they'd go to people who knew the most about what we do know about intelligence, and that is neuroscientists. They talk to neuroscientists, they get ideas, and in turn, neuroscientists, when they get stuck, they go to AI people and say, can you model this aspect of neural functioning to help them decode and better understand how we think? So AI, the development of AI and the development of neuroscience have proceeded hand in hand together through these past decades. And so that means if we understand a little bit more about how the human brain works, we can actually understand how to use AI more effectively. And if we understand a bit more about AI, we can use our own brains more effectively. So let's just dive right in and look at what learning means when you go and look in the brain. As it turns out, there is a fundamental building block in the brain, and that's the neuron. There's about 86 billion neurons in the brain, so you can't really run out of space as far as things to learn, although you may have trouble finding what you've learned. But I know you're thinking, how? Okay, so that's where you're going to get into the super boring scientific stuff. So let's spice it up a little bit. We're going to use a metaphor to help us better understand how a neuron functions. And the metaphor we're going to use is my favorite little space alien. So our space alien has 3 legs, and those are analogous to what are called dendrites on real neurons. And then the space alien's got these little toes, and those are analogous to dendritic spines. And lastly, it's got an arm that reaches upwards, which is kind of like an axon. And what neurons do is they like to reach out and sort of tickle the toe of an adjoining neuron. What this really means is that they like to reach out and send an electrical signal. Well, it's mostly electrical. When it jumps that little gap, it's carried by neurotransmitters. But in essence, whenever you're learning anything, you are simply creating a connected clump of neurons in long-term memory. This is whether you're learning how to take a derivative in math, or to conjugate a verb in English, or to do a dance step, or to play a musical instrument, or do something in sports. Whatever you are learning, you are simply making connections between neurons in long-term memory. Now, I had an engineering student come up to me once, and he waved his test, and he says, how could I have flunked this test? And he had really flunked it. And he said, how could I have flunked this test? I understood it when you said it in class. Educators have been so indoctrinated into the idea that conceptual understanding is the only golden key to learning that they overlook the fact that if you can't remember what you learned, you really haven't learned it. Unfortunately, educators and psychologists have been telling you for a number of decades now, you don't need to look things up. You can always just, or you don't need to memorize things. You can always just look things up. But that is absolutely not true. I mean, would I speak Arabic if I just went to Google Translate and used Google Translate? You must have that information in your own long-term memory if you are to become an expert in anything. So how do you strengthen those connections between neurons? Practice, but very specific practice. You do not use concept mapping because that's been shown to be far, far less effective than simply retrieving the information from your own memory. So, unfortunately, at a time when students are often overwhelmed with the amount of information they need to learn, we're telling them to use ineffective methods like concept mapping when they could be using far, far better methods. Now, what happens if you don't practice with what you're learning? Well, your little synaptic janitors can sweep those connections away. And you think you knew it, but those connections are gone. Ultimately, you want to have nice, strong, rich, thick sets of links in long-term memory that you can easily pull to mind whenever you might need it. If you don't have those links, well, you cannot think critically about what you're getting from AI. So when I teach in Finland, for example, I nursing students, for example, are having terrible problems learning mathematics. And the reality is, because from a young age, they have been taught if they just conceptually understood mathematics, that was enough, and multiplication. So they didn't memorize, really internalize the multiplication tables. So you might say to someone like that, 12 times 12 is 289. And they'd say, sounds good to me. And what is happening now in Finland, a nursing student can type 10 times 10 and get 1,000 because they mistyped something. And they won't even notice the error because they don't have anything inside them that says there's an error there. They can't make predictions, and predictions are incredibly important. I also have a friend who he wrote a book. And this is, my friend is a PhD, very intelligent man, gave me this book, 280 pages long. And I have to say, it was the worst book I've ever read. It was repetitive, poor writing, predictable plot, just bad in every way, shape, and form. How could my friend have given me something so bad? It was because he used ChatGPT to help him write this book. And he himself had not read enough to internalize what it meant to write a good book. So when he got something back from ChatGPT, looked good to him, he had nothing to reference things with. Critical thinking about what you get from AI always, always goes back to what you've got within your own brain. So learning is, it's like baking a cake. It's got lots of different ingredients. So I want to turn to another aspect of learning that's really important. So this involves the brain's two different modes of learning. One of them is the mode that occurs when you're focusing on something. And you'll have a tight network, usually on the left hemisphere, that activates when you're focusing. And then when you're daydreaming, you have a much more widespread network that activates throughout the brain. It's kind of when you're mind wandering or you might be imagining something. So to better understand these two different modes, I'm going to use my best teaching tool and your best teaching tool, which is a metaphor. And this metaphor is that of a pinball machine. Now, if to play pinball, if you don't remember, but you might have seen something like this, you just pull back on a plunger, a ball goes bouncing around, and that's how you get points. So I'm going to put this pinball machine right on the human brain. There it is. So this is the pinball machine on the brain, and it's our metaphor for the focus mode of thinking. Notice how tight together those rubber bumpers are. In reality, if I put it somewhere, it'd be in a small, much smaller area in part of the brain, but this is bigger so we can see it. Now, let's say that I asked you to multiply 22 times 197. You might pull out a piece of paper, or you might do it in your head, and you multiply these numbers using the algorithm. Those black lines there are like the neural pathway that you developed because you learned how to multiply. Now, this is how you might handle something you're focusing on if you already know how to do that particular task. But what if you're learning something completely new? Like, let's say you're a young person and you've learned multiplication, but you haven't learned division yet. So your teacher tells you all about it. You come home, you're working on your first division problem all by yourself. You look at the textbook, it doesn't seem to make sense. You can't quite remember what the teacher was saying. And what can happen is you're trying to lay this pattern. See, there's the pattern that would be for division, except your mind, your thoughts can keep slithering back up to multiplication because it's more comfortable. And as a consequence, you keep looking at this problem and trying to do it, but you just can't make any progress. And you get more and more frustrated. You can't get the answer in the book. You can't figure it out. You finally close the book, you walk away, and gradually, as those thoughts die away, your mind goes into a very different mode of learning, and that's that diffuse mode. This diffuse mode, the mind-wandering network, allows your thoughts to wander much more widely. You cannot think in that careful, detailed way you can when you're in the focus mode, but you can at least get to the new place you want to be in to be able to solve that problem at long last when you go back to focus mode. So this diffuse mode allows your brain to consolidate, to make sense of things. So learning does not just take place when you're focusing on things. It also takes place when you're not focusing and you're not inputting anything into your working memory. So this is why it can be so important when students are studying. They should study for a while and then take a break, but do not pick up the cell phone. They can have some of that terrific coffee. They can take a little break of any sort, but not any substantive focus on things, because what that will do is sort of overwrite what they have already just been learning. If you take a break where nothing is coming into working memory, you're just kind of daydreaming a little bit, your brain can tag the information you've just learned, and at night it will reinforce those very patterns. Just to give you a little sense as well, sometimes attentional difficulties are common for many in many classes. And here's a way to conceptualize that. With attentional difficulties, it's almost as if you have holes in that focused mode. so your attention can fall away and you start mind wandering. So a student might look at you, whoa, shiny, they get distracted. And it's not something they can help. It's actually due to lack of dopamine being produced by the dopamine neurons in their ventral tegmental area. And so you might think this is a terrible thing. In some ways, it is hard. It makes it harder to learn. But on the other hand, it seems to provide for more creativity. That default mode network is very much affiliated with creativity. And a secret superpower of those with ADHD is if you can get them to be internally motivated, that they are curious and interested about what you're teaching, they can hyper focus. They can focus better than a neurotypical individual. So I want to move now to something that is valuable for us to realize in this age of AI, and that is that we have a large language model within our own brain. Now, I had mentioned that we have links in long-term memory that we lay whenever we learn something, but I was kind of tricking you a little bit. There's actually two different ways that we can lay those neural links. And each of these different neural links have different qualities to them. They specialize in different kinds of tasks. So it helps us as educators to realize what those two different neural pathways are that produce these two different kinds of neural links, because it will help us with our teaching, as you will see. So you don't need to remember the neural anatomy that I'm describing here, but just remember there are two pathways. The first pathway is you take information into working memory, which I like to abbreviate or to indicate with this little octopus, or it's like a quadrupus. It's got 4 arms on it, meaning we can hold on to about 4 pieces of information, just a limited amount of what we can temporarily hold and work with consciously in mind. So we take in information into working memory, goes through the hippocampus into long-term memory, and this is called the declarative pathway. It's the pathway of explanation, like what I'm doing right now. I'm explaining something to you. It's going in your working memory through your hippocampus and forming weak links in long-term memory. How would you strengthen them? Well, when you go away from this, try to pull to mind what were the key ideas that she was talking about. That will help you strengthen. But there's that other pathway that I've mentioned, and that's the automatic pathway through the basal ganglia. This pathway is the pathway of habits. If you've ever gotten in a car, driven home, and then you wonder, how did I get home? Because you weren't really consciously thinking about it. That was this basal ganglia set of links that allowed you've driven home enough times that you're very familiar with it, and it became a habitual action. Now, we need both kinds of sets of links to function well in today's society. But to better get a real understanding of these two different systems, I'm going to simplify and look from a slightly different perspective. So this blue box right here, that one is that declarative pathway. And the orange box, that's the automatic pathway through the basal ganglia. So let's say that, well, first off, if you've read the book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, This hippocampal system is the slow system. The basal ganglia, that's pretty much the fast system. So if you're consciously thinking about something, you might be thinking about a math problem. What happens is your working memory kind of, in some sense, talks to your hippocampus and says, okay, let's go step by step through this problem. You work it through and you're consciously aware of what you've just done. But that other way of learning is completely different. You're not aware of how you're learning. And it's kind of like this. Let's say I was learning how to hit a baseball. So I would take, I kind of say, yeah, I'm not aware of it, but I'm sort of saying, hey, basal ganglia, hit the baseball. I hit it, and then I see what direction the baseball went, and oh, wait, it went way off the way it wasn't supposed to go. So I hit it again, and I hit it again, and I'm gradually learning how to hit that baseball, but I am completely unaware of how my brain is doing this learning. It's almost like magic. What is happening inside this basal ganglia, completely non-conscious learning mechanism? It is a deep neural net. And that net, so every one of these little circles, that's a neuron. And the line to the next neuron is kind of like the axon, dendritic spine, dendrite to the next neuron. And you can see it's a deep neural net because we've got a deep set of layers. In this case, 5 layers. Now, in reality, we've got feed forward, we've got feedback, we've got, lots of things going on. But you can see here that there's these layers, and this is how neurons kind of communicate with one another in the basal ganglia. And not to say they don't communicate this way elsewhere. There are deep neural nets in many places. But this basal ganglia one is particularly interesting. So let's say you hit a baseball. Okay, you hit it. You're not conscious of, but you can see what the output was. You hit it again, and you hit it again, and you're getting better. You are strengthening some neural connections. You're weakening other neural connections. And what you're really doing is forming a set of weighted links called a value function that it is what lies behind your expertise in being able to hit that baseball. But it's, so this is really important for motor skills, learning motor skills. But it's more than that. For example, I have my little granddaughter. She's 2.5 years old, wonderful little, and she goes, just not long ago, it was mama, 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 mama. She said, oh, my daughter says, oh, she said, mama. And how is my granddaughter? What is she doing? She's realizing she made a certain sequence of sounds that got her a little reward. Her mother gets excited. In fact, this system, the basal ganglia system, is really what's behind our ability to learn our native language. So this system kind of becomes less functional as we get into our teenage years and into adulthood, whereas this hippocampal system gets more powerful. So one goes down, one goes up. And what's really fascinating, this is part of why, as you grow older, it becomes more difficult to learn another language. You often have to learn it, at least in part, through that declarative system. They will tell you the patterns instead of you having to figure out all the patterns, which is what babies and infants and toddlers do. So, so this system, the basal ganglia system, is really it's the system that's appropriate for experiential learning, for the kinds of learning that kids do in early elementary school, in Montessori school. But as kids get older, as you're learning more difficult things, mathematics, how to read and make sense of what you're reading, you're using this hippocampal system, that declarative system. Just as a quick aside, if you're talking about neurodiverse students, there's a very famous kickboxer named Bill Wallace, and he damaged his right knee early on. And so what he found he could do was even though he couldn't use that knee very well, he would pivot so it was behind him. He would use it as a pivot point, and then he would kick with his left leg. And he got so much extra practice because he could only use his left leg, really, that he became world champion because he was so really, really good with that left leg. In a similar way, humans have two learning systems. They've got that non-conscious basal ganglia and the conscious hippocampal system. If one system is damaged, the other system can become stronger. So what we can sometimes see in those who are on the autistic spectrum is this system, that basal ganglia system, can become really powerful. And this is the system that recognizes patterns. So if you learn, for example, the multiplication tables early on, and you begin to learn those mathematical patterns, sometimes those who are on the autistic spectrum can recognize those patterns and see them much more quickly than a neurotypical individual. But remember, explanation happens through this conscious hippocampal system. So if you might have a really good student who is able to see these patterns because they're on the autistic spectrum, and then you say something to them like, well, if you can't explain it, you don't understand it. Well, that's not true. A person on the spectrum can understand something very, very well using this basal ganglia system, but not be able to explain what they understand. And we can turn them off of learning when we insist that they must explain. If you look at Fermat's last theorem, it's like x to the n plus y to the n equals z to the n. There's no solution for n is greater than 2. So Fermat famously wrote on the margin of his paper that he didn't have room for the proof. He intuited this, and to actually prove it through that declarative system took another 270 years or so and 150 pages. So sometimes you can really see things with this basal ganglia system, see patterns that aren't obvious to other people. Likewise, for those with dyslexia, the hippocampal system can become very powerful because that basal ganglia system may not work as well. And this, for some reason, seems to result in incredible visualization skills. So just knowing a little about the brain can be really, really helpful in understanding students' different capabilities. But I want to also give you a sense that this is at root, it's exactly how large language models are trained. It's how how we get them to, create and act almost human-like. Interestingly, this basal ganglia system, which is so like a large language model, it's like the large language model in a strange other way. Researchers are attempting to replicate our chain of thought reasoning, which we do through that hippocampal system. They haven't been able to really do that so far. In humans, if you have the hippocampus is inactivated or damaged, that happens in Alzheimer's. Those with Alzheimer's, what do? They hallucinate. So it's almost like this basal ganglia system is like a human that has no hippocampus, and so it can do some incredible things, but it also is a great assistant that's occasionally a little psychopathic. So you have to be a little careful with it. But even more so, I want to show how this relates to our teaching. So if you think of that orange box as the basal ganglia, that experiential system, blue box, that hippocampal declarative system. So lecture is that declarative, explanatory system. Active and student-centered learning is that basal ganglia system. But what have we been told by educationalists over the past 50 years? Lecture is bad. You should get rid of it. Does that make sense to you? I mean, like half of the way the brain learns, especially when you get into your adolescent and you're trying to really understand difficult things like advanced mathematics and parsing your reading, you got to throw that out. That doesn't make any sense at all. And in fact, the largest study in education that was ever conducted in order to compare different techniques to find the best way of teaching found that the best approach is to mix lecture with active learning. Mix them up, do them both together. Now, should it be a lot of lecture and a little active learning, or a little lecture and a lot of active learning, or balanced in between? It depends on what is the student's prior knowledge, what's the subject matter, how old are the students. All of these matter, but this mixture of lecture with active learning is called direct instruction. And this has been what has been shown to be the most powerful way of teaching students. And this is a study of younger students, but it was the largest educational research study ever conducted, cost $100 million. It ran for 10 years. It compared 9 different models of teaching. And what they found is that you can see here's students' performance, and what they found in essence is that direct instruction is so much better than every other approach they tried that the study was never published. Because think about it, you got eight different approaches that were all completely outclassed by direct instruction. Those other 8 said, oh, no, you can't publish. No, we decided there's all sorts of problems with this. Of course they did, because this study actually showed that some ways of teaching can actually move students backwards. So direct instruction is it is the best approach to learning. And unfortunately, this study was coming out right when constructivism was starting to rule. Student-centered learning was starting to rule. And so, again, it was not published. So I want you to realize that in education, only 0.13% of all education articles are replicated. What does that mean? That means if you look at all the education articles, only a tiny fraction is ever redone by another group to see if the results are actually accurate. This is why you get within education all these fads. It's this year it's open classrooms, that year it's I don't know, the latest one to come from the States. So watch for this one is teach children to write when they're standing and writing on a vertical surface, and they will learn math better. I kid you not. That is it's a published study. So there is a lot of really, really bad science that comes out. It's hardly even qualifies as science, because if you look at that 0.13%, guess what? Half of those studies were replicated by the graduate students of the original people who did the studies. So, of course, they find that that study is a good study. And many studies are simply surveys. And the surveys will say, oh, my teacher taught in this way, and I loved it. I could get up and I could teach students air guitar. I could, I would, have them get on stage. They get to play, and everybody cheers. It makes them feel really good. They would give me a survey that says, "Gosh, they just love learning to play the guitar," but they would be learning to play air guitar without even knowing it. Oftentimes, what's taught when students are really, really just loving the class is super easy. And then what happens is students will get to the university and take their first calculus course and then go off to become to study psychology instead, because it's easier. You want to be preparing your students well. If I look around me at my school of engineering, which I'm really proud of, or schools of engineering throughout the US, where are my colleagues coming from? They're coming from countries, 80 to 90% of those colleagues of mine come from countries that still respect at least some modicum of rote learning. And in the Middle East, it's a tradition that should have great meaning for you. You don't want to throw it away, because educators have some poor theories about what it actually about the importance of memory and memorization. There's a concept I call a paradigm cartel. And that is that groupthink can lock up entire fields and disciplines. And I'll give you just a quick idea of how this happened in the field of Alzheimer's research. As it turns out, everyone pretty much came to believe in the idea that amyloid plaques, this kind of gunk that grows between neurons, were the cause of Alzheimer's. So what this meant was, for 30 years, all forward progress has been completely blocked, because all the people who organize conferences, who give out monies, who are the chief editors of journals, all the major players were completely convinced that amyloid plaques were the cause of Alzheimer's. And it turns out they believe this based on what now appear to have been fraudulent publications in top-notch journals. So you think that top professors are all operating independently. They are not. they can turn into kind of a self-reinforcing cartel that can block forward progress. This is what we see in education. Education in particular, it's a little like optical illusions. If you look at these two tables, you can see one table looks a lot bigger than the other, but they're actually the same size. Just as we have optical illusions, we can have illusions of helping. So, of my own research involves pathologies of altruism. I published a major edited volume in Oxford University Press, published an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. All pathological altruism, in essence, means the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And in education, pathological altruism is everywhere. There's so many good intentions, and people become so convinced that their efforts to help correct that they do not do anything to actually check to see whether what they're doing truly is working and helpful. The biggest place we see this is when it comes to student-centered learning. Doesn't that sound like such a great concept? You know, students create their own learning, and they do. And it sounds so good. But the reality is that students don't know anything. You need teachers. Teachers are really important. Am I going to sit a kid in a room by themselves and say, okay, now you figure out Arabic? So there's a little bit it's become self-reinforcing as a paradigm cartel that you can't even question whether student-centered approaches really are very effective. But you can see worldwide what the outcomes of these kinds of educational approaches are. So, for example, there's something called the Flynn effect. And in this effect, IQ scores were found to rise pretty much around the world from the 1930s to the 70s. And researchers found that the reason for that was, in essence, that students were exposed to quality education, really improved their cognition. But since the 1970s, guess what? Lots of research is revealing that in Western countries, there's been a substantive decline in education. And I should point something out. This is a time when everybody kept going around going, oh, we're teaching learning how to learn, and we're teaching critical thinking. Well, critical thinking is a buzzword unless you're actually also teaching the facts that are necessary for critical thinking. And the learning how to learn was just what people felt was helpful for learning. It wasn't necessarily truly teaching them how to learn. What happened in the 70s that really kind of seemed to kick this off? That's when calculators came out. And it wasn't calculators that were the problem. It was the fact that all these teachers and psychologists started saying, I don't need to remember things. You can always just look it up. If we are not careful now, we could see an even sharper decline in education as students start offloading even more to ChatGPT because we can't be giving them essays and homework in the same way that we did before. It's very important to realize that you are the guardians of education. You are not just, the guide on the side and the sage on the stage. Yeah, they're both valuable concepts, but you also need to think of yourself as a guardian of knowledge, a gatekeeper, and that students pass through what you're teaching and come out on the other side with some valuable knowledge in their brains. Otherwise, you really haven't done what good teaching is needed to help those people through their lives. So in New Zealand, I was recently there, and I have to say, so if you look at their own country evaluation over the last couple of decades, wow, the students are doing great. But actually, they haven't been, because they've been lowering and lowering the standards. If you look internationally, comparatively, New Zealand has been going down and down. They adopted, it's like ground zero of student-centered constructivist approaches over the past 30 years. And now they have lost so much ground that it's even difficult for them to find elementary school teachers who are not afraid of math because they haven't internalized those important concepts. So prior knowledge is absolutely critical in our learning. Like if I asked you to remember this sentence the way it's written in 5 minutes, most of you probably couldn't do that. But for me, I'm like, Zilioni Pingvin, yes, Yarlaka. It's easy because I have a lot of prior knowledge about Russian. So that's just a green penguin is eating an apple. But so it's not that I'm smart, it's that I have lots of prior knowledge. So prior knowledge is really important. When we're teaching, we want to scaffold, that is, give information bit by bit. But there's something more that you want to know about scaffolding. There's something called the 85% rule for optimal learning. That just means a student needs to be able to be successful around 85% of the time. So if you're thinking of it kind of like, a goalpost, there are little neural links. If they can get it over the goalpost, like most of the time, they will remain motivated to continue learning. But when a student sits down to a problem, it's kind of like this. So when I have my iPhone, I might, drive up in an Uber, get out of the Uber, and I don't know which way to go. Which way is north? Sometimes it'll say go north, and I don't know where north is. I don't have a compass on me. But if you look, see how there's a little guide, like a flashlight on your on a typical cell phone when you're looking for directions. So it tells you at least a little bit what direction should you be looking at and going towards. We need that kind of thing in the high dimensions of neural space. Remember, I mentioned 86 billion neurons? There are actually 100 trillion synaptic connections. That means the number of dimensions in neural space, the number of ways you can get things wrong is enormous. So students need to have like some sort of guidance about what do you want them to hook together? What are they supposed to be learning? If you can ask a question, a Socratic question that sort of leads them close to what they need to put together, that can lower, the dimensions, the number of dimensions they need to do their little Markov scan through, and it can help them to see what they need to be finally putting together. See, notice these little dashed lines. You want them to do the active learning, do the constructive approach, construct their own learning, but you need to get them pretty close so they're not wasting time. And if you allow them to get that little dopamine hit of, they made those connections, they can connect things together and it works. It's a really great way to learn. So notice you can have students just outright memorize something, but they don't get practice in searching for those different ways of connecting things together. They're not getting that creative spark of making that connection themselves. So great teaching often scaffolds them close enough to where they can more easily see where the solution lies, and they themselves can make those connections. So ultimately, we will want our students to really be able to have a bigger neural space, bigger and bigger, so they can be more and more creative in their own solutions. As I'm closing, I just want to say, as we know, student-centered learning is important, but guess what? Great teaching matters also. And I salute you all for the great teaching that you are doing. Thank you so much. Oh, I should give you a little, there's more neuroscience there if you would like. So our latest paper is the memory, it's the memory paradox of memory, and it's one of the most downloaded articles now on SSRN. So there's something like nearly 17,000 downloads so far. So that paper's there. There's a link as well to this particular PowerPoint presentation, and also to other pieces of information, everything I can think of that might be helpful for you. So with that, I thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Bob, for this insightful presentation. Now we will open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Baba, for the interesting presentation. And I think it's a good start for our 40-week activities and program. I have just a general question. I hope I understood your objective or your summary of your presentation at the end about integrating different techniques for teaching in order to have a meaningful learning for our students. My question to you about, you talked about conscious and non-conscious techniques that can be used. Can you elaborate more on how can we integrate both in the classroom so we can achieve what we would like to achieve about enhancing the learning of our students?
That is a terrific question. Let me, I'm going to share a little bit of slide about that, because it is, okay, so here we go. Let's see. Hang on here. Let me just share again. There we go. Okay. So we've got these two, whoops, gosh, stop that. Okay. Come back here. Okay, so here's our two different systems. And if we look at these systems, first off, just to kind of know what is the difference, I'll kind of just put it up quickly here, because knowing some of the differences between these two different systems will also help us understand how to use these different, or how to teach to these systems. So this automatic system, you're not conscious of it. You have to develop these links through practice. Repetition is, I don't know, in Russian we say повторение matsuchения. repetition is the mother of learning. You can't explain it very easily. It involves complex patterns. It's really slow to learn. So, like learning how to type on a keyboard takes time. But once you learn it, you're really fast. Now, notice declarative learning, you can learn it quickly, but it's really slow to use. So, like, let's say that I started learning Arabic. I would learn it using this declarative system. And so I would speak it really slowly and with difficulty. So, but if I practiced a lot, I would get these automatic links and I would start to be much, much faster. These automatic links are not very flexible as opposed to declarative links that are very flexible. So how do we teach to these two different systems? It turns out that retrieval practice, pulling the ideas to mind, that will help with both automatic and declarative learning. Spaced repetition, doing repetition over a number of days, that would help with both systems. Explanation helps with declarative learning, but automatic system, the best thing you can do is interleaving. So what is interleaving? I'll contrast it with blocking. Blocking means, like, let's say I'm teaching about, binomial distribution, negative binomial distribution, and geometric distribution when I'm teaching statistics. So I'm teaching, I might give 10 problems on binomial, 10 more problems, negative binomial, and so forth. So I give a block of problems at one time. But that actually is not what I do during the final exam. And also, when students are learning a concept, you think you've taught that concept, and you have, but you haven't taught them the difference between concepts. What you want to do is, right after you've introduced, like, binomial, they practiced a little bit of negative binomial. Now mix them up together and then add in geometric distribution. Or if you're teaching a foreign language, you don't want to just teach present tense with a bunch of problems. You want to mix it up like you do in regular speech. You want to have present tense, past tense, future tense, preterite, and so forth. So mixing up is a really, really good way to teach, so that you are building that automatic systems understanding. The very best, one of the top 100 researchers in the world, what he did, as he told me, was he would go through his studies when he was, in his undergraduate years, and he would try to open a book so that he didn't know what that chapter was. And he would just try to pick out a problem and work it randomly. What he was really doing was interleaving. Interleaving helps you know the difference between closely related patterns that students often mix up. So, to help build that basal ganglia automaticity, don't just use what the textbook gives you, which is like, chapter 7, they give you a bunch of problems on something. Mix up in your assignments so that, they get practice picking out the difference between things. Otherwise, they learn to use a hammer. They learn one tool, and then they think every tool is like that, and they start using tools inappropriately as a consequence. So interleaving is really the best approach to to trying to ensure that basal ganglia automatic pathway is also developed.
Okay, thank you. We'll have another question here.
Hi, I heard a rumor maybe that it takes 48 hours to form a long-term memory. And I'm just wondering, is that true, false, partially true? How is it different for hippocampus versus ganglia? And then if it is true, how does that tell us whether we should be doing project-based learning or multiple homeworks over the weekend, or how does that all fit together? What can you say?
So that's another really good question. So I want to, I suppose that's a rule of thumb that you could sort of roughly say is true, but there's so many exceptions. Like when you're learning a foreign language, sometimes you can go over a word dozens of times and still forget it. But it's one thing that might help you is to understand what's going on in the hippocampus when you're learning. Why is this hopping back up here? Come back here. Okay, come back up here. And let's get our little hippocampus back again. Okay, so there we go. Okay, so if you think of your hippocampus, this guy is really hip. So that's my representative for the hippocampus. Now notice, look, here's a hippocampal neuron, a representative of it. Notice how flimsy this connection is. And so you can make a connection in the hippocampus. This is what happens when a student is cramming. Now let's look at what happens in the neocortex. So neocortical learning is when you do it over a number of days. Look at that. Look at the difference between here we go. Okay, so we'll just take it right there. So look at the difference. You've got a hippocampus, you've got these very weak links. You can actually learn something, cram it, and learn it, and it's there long enough to take a test. But if you have not practiced over a number of days, you don't have the strong links in your neocortex that really are what last. So, I think it's a little bit misleading to say, oh yeah, 48 hours to make a memory. Well, what kind of memory? How often have you practiced it? It's actually something that should be done, day after day for several days in most people in order to really get these strong neocortical links, which are sort of in the outer shell of your brain, not in just the hippocampus. So I think that's kind of like that rule of thumb that is probably really, misleading to greater or lesser extent, because there's so many different things going on in the brain. Sir Isaac Newton, was known for learning something, and he would learn it really well, but then he would just let it sit for a couple of years. And then when he would return to it, he would have a far, far deeper understanding of what he was thinking about. So would you say that it was 48 hours for him to, come up with some of his brilliant ideas? Well, actually, sometimes it took him years of cogitating and consolidation. That there's those little wonderful little connections. Oh, I guess I could show you a consolidation picture if you're interested in it. But I do tend to go on about these things. So let's see if I can find my consolidation picture, which is really kind of a cool one. Might have. At any rate, so hopefully that gives you a better sense of that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We'll have the last question by the corrector. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor, for excellent presentation.
My question is, there was a slide actually in which you have shown that from 1930s to 1980s, there's a decline in IQ. And what I understood is that, yeah. So, and you mentioned that the decline was somehow, that was the time when the calculators are there in the market, right? And I think that brings to the question, though the theme of our these 2 weeks workshop is the use of AI in education and the learning process. And that shows that there should be intelligent use of the AI in our learning process. The integration should not be the use of AI just for the sake of AI usage in the learning. However, it should be very, very carefully and well crafted and well thought. So my question is, what do you think, for example, in my course, any course ABCD we are teaching, at what stage of my course I should be, integrating some sort of AI in that course, or maybe in a lecture, for example, where I should be implementing. And what I learned from your lecture also, there should be some, some knowledge in hand before we start experimenting and using that. So in general, because most of us are not teaching computers and so on, so what do you think at what stage of my course maybe we should be experimenting and utilizing the AI in our courses? Thank you.
I love your question, and I love your thinking about all of this because it's so important. We are right in the middle of a total revolution. So it's a little bit, we're blindly trying to move forward in the best way we can for students. And so, I mean, when I am teaching, what I would try to do is show students, for example, like if they are bored with a subject, show them how to use AI to help them get more motivated. Ask them, teach them how they can use it to help themselves become more curious about whatever they're learning. Teach them how to use AI to help them find metaphors for whatever they're learning, because metaphors will build from prior knowledge to allow them to learn more quickly and effectively. But I would also just be teaching in the traditional way, the same way we've always taught. I'd be very careful about ensuring that they really know the material, but using AI to some extent where it doesn't detract, and always testing all the time so that you are certain that they're really getting that information in their own minds, and they're not just fooling themselves by going off to ChatGPT. So I love your thinking about this. I think that if the whole university takes this careful, judicious approach where, yes, AI is important, but we're going to make sure that all of our graduates are always known for having a solid foundation of knowledge, it will be, you will uphold the name, and throughout the kingdom, you will always have, high respect and high regard for your graduates. And that's what you always want.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Bart, for being with us today. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. So now we'll have about 10 minutes break, and we'll have a second keynote talk. Thank you.